We'll see if somebody shows. The Subcommittee on Crime will come to order without objection. The Chair will be authorized to declare recesses during votes in the House. The Chair yields himself 5 minutes in order to make an opening statement. Today's hearing examines the subject of prescription drug abuse in America. According to the most recent data from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, legal and illicit drugs killed almost 40,000 people nationwide in 2009. Over 100 people die from drug overdoses in the United States every day. Nearly 3 out of 4 prescription drug overdoses are caused by prescription painkillers, also called opioid pain relievers. Common examples of these painkillers are Vicodin, Percocet, OxyContin, and Demerol. In 2008, there were nearly 15,000 deaths from prescription painkiller overdoses. For every one of these deaths, there are 10 admissions for drug abuse treatment and 32 emergency room visits for misuse or abuse of prescription drugs. That amounts to over 475,000 emergency room visits per year, a number which has doubled in just the last 5 years. Prescription painkillers work by decreasing the perception of pain. These powerful drugs can create feelings of euphoria, cause physical dependence, and frequently lead to addiction. Prescription painkillers also slow down a person's breathing. A person abusing prescription painkillers might take increasingly larger doses to achieve a euphoric effect. These larger doses can cause breathing to slow down so much that breathing stops, resulting in a fatal overdose. Very few prescription drugs involved in overdoses come from pharmacy theft. The vast majority come from prescriptions obtained by one person and sold or given to another. More than 3 out of 4 people who misuse prescription painkillers get their drugs from someone else. For the past few years, individuals who doctor shop or seek care from multiple physicians but fraudulently pretend to be in pain have been a primary source of diverted prescription drugs. The law enforcement officials in Florida, once the epicenter of prescription drug diversion, have left other states to initiate expensive enforcement programs as these so-called pill mills migrate across the country. Prescription drug abuse has been an epidemic for much too long. Some of the more notable people who have died from prescription drugs include Marilyn Monroe, Bruce Lee, and Elvis Presley. Even former Indiana Senator Edward A. Hannigan overdosed on morphine in 1859. In December of 2010, a 13-year-old Utah boy died after stealing a bottle of OxyContin from a kitchen counter of a friend's house. He took all the pills in the bottle except one and died in his sleep. Famous or not, no one is immune from the grip of prescription drug overdose. This hearing will explore the growing issue of prescription drug abuse in our nation. We have here today 4 distinguished members of Congress who have dedicated their efforts to stop prescription drug abuse in America. I look forward to hearing about their legislative proposals and other efforts to address serious national challenge. And I would like to thank our witnesses for participating in today's hearing. It is now my pleasure to recognize for his opening statement the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, prescriptive drug abuse is a serious problem. The number of overdose fatalities has increased dramatically over the recent years. I must admit, though, Mr. Chairman, I'm puzzled as to the purpose and usefulness of today's hearing. I'm used to hearings being an opportunity for witnesses to put forth varying views regarding an issue or issues before us, with the opportunity to question such witnesses to gain a keener insight as to an understanding of the issues. We would then have a legislative hearing for further input and analysis, including legal analysis, and assuring that we have constitutional and effective legislation. While I have no doubt that our colleagues who are witnesses today will provide helpful information, I anticipate that they will discuss the bills that they have sponsored or co-sponsored, which makes them advocates for the bills and limits us to one side of the debate on the issues raised by those bills. Therefore, I trust and also ask that this hearing not serve as the only basis for any Judiciary Committee or other consideration of legislation that we'll hear about, but merely serve as a traditional opportunity we give members on occasion to appear before us to present their legislation. The bills I anticipate my colleagues will discuss as witnesses include H.R. 1316, 1065, 1925, and 2119. To the extent that they provide additional education, training, and research on safer administration and use of prescriptive drugs, I'm inclined to believe that they may contribute to effectively addressing the problem. However, to the extent that they impose congressionally mandated restrictions on access to legitimate medications and business as usual draconian increases in federal penalties, I'm inclined to believe that they will be counterproductive. Such approaches are no likely to be successful as our efforts to effectively address illicit drugs. They will lead to overcriminalization, overfederalization, and cause many people the laws purport to protect end up with unjust and inflexible prison terms, such as the mandatory minimums, which one of the bills calls for. Mandatory minimums have been proven to be a waste of the taxpayers' money and violate common sense when compared to traditional sentencing. And I would ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to introduce the RAND study that points this out.
Without objection.
When we think of a pill mill operator dispensing death and destruction on a mass scale, we may conclude that no punishment is too great, but without definition of what limits the application of such person to such circumstances, the, quote, pill mill operator may be a college student in a dorm room with a bunch of pills giving to his dorm mates. What has proven to work best to address drug abuse in general, including prescriptive drug abuse, are evidence-based solutions aimed at preventing drug abuse, addiction, injury, and death, rather than inflexibly rushing to increase penalties and restrict legitimate access to prescriptive drugs. We should not continue to take the same approaches, hoping for different results. I'm not saying that we should not punish lawmakers, but we're already using the criminal justice system as much as productively can be used. We now need to focus on prevention and early intervention. There are innovative evidence-based approaches that are not likely to be discussed today. One is the use of naloxone. That is a life-saving medicine used to reverse opiate-based drug overdoses. It has been FDA approved since 1971 and is the first line of treatment for paramedics and emergency room physicians who encounter an opiate overdose victim. It presents no potential for abuse because it has no pharmacological effect. It has no effect if it's taken by a person who does not have opiates in their system. It takes as little as 2 minutes to start working and provides a 30 to 90-minute window to call for medical assistance during a drug overdose. Drugs that can be reversed are heroin, Oxycontin, methadone, Vicodin, and several other drugs. We're also concerned about drug overdose deaths and other harmful If we are concerned about drug overdose deaths, we should be considering this as one of the suggestions. Second thing we need to consider, Mr. Chairman, are a 911 Good Samaritan law. The chance of surviving an overdose like that of surviving a heart attack depends greatly on how fast one receives medical treatment. Witnesses to heart attacks rarely think twice about calling 911, but witnesses to an overdose often hesitate to call or simply don't make a call because they fear police involvement. People using illegal drugs often fear arrest, even in cases where they need professional medical advice or assistance for a friend or family member. The best way to encourage overdose witnesses to speak up and call 911 is to provide some kind of immunity to those that make such calls. Mr. Chairman, such legislation does not protect people from arrest for other offenses, such as outstanding warrants or other crimes, but this policy protects only the caller and the overdose victim from arrest and prosecution simply for calling 911. Several state legislatures, including New York, New Mexico, Washington, Illinois, and Connecticut, have passed 911 Good Samaritan laws, and Congress should consider doing the same. For the reasons stated above, Mr. Chairman, I agree that with my colleagues that prescriptive drug abuse is an issue about which we should be concerned. Anyone who has a friend that's a physician or a dentist will recite patients that present with symptoms that call for these drugs, and they go doctor to doctor shopping, and we need to do something about those who will actually prescribe to those patients. But we should not rush to enact such legislation without thorough assessment of the effective options we have before us. And I certainly do not agree that imposing more severe mandatory minimums on physicians and pharmacists who provide legitimate medications would be a useful, good use of our time or efforts. Mr. Chairman, I'd ask also unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter to us from the Drug Policy Alliance.
Without objection. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's witnesses. Hal Rogers has represented the 5th District of Kentucky since 1981. He currently serves as chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, of which he has been a member for 29 years. He received both his Bachelor of Arts and LLB from the University of Kentucky. Congressman Nick Rahall has represented the 3rd District of West Virginia since 1976. He currently serves as the ranking member of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and received his Bachelor of Arts from Duke University in 1971. Mary Bono Mack has represented the 45th District of California since 1998. Ms. Bono Mack sits on the House Energy and Commerce Committee and serves as chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Commerce, Manufacturing, and Trade. She received her BFA from the University of Southern California in 1984. Congressman Stephen Lynch has represented the 9th District of Massachusetts since 2001. He currently sits on the Financial Services Committee and the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, where he serves as ranking member of the Subcommittee on Federal Workforce, U.S. Postal Service, and Labor Policy. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Wentworth Institute of Technology and his Master in Public Administration in 1998 from Harvard. Without objection, all of the witnesses' written statements will be entered into the record in their entirety, and I ask that you please summarize your testimony in 5 minutes or less, and we'll start out with Congressman Rogers, since I kind of respect seniority.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Sensenbrenner, Ranking Member Scott, Mr. Gowdy, and other members of this great committee, thank you for granting me a few minutes to speak on an epidemic that quietly began in rural parts of Kentucky, West Virginia, and Virginia, one doctor at a time, and now grips every corner of our great nation in prolific fashion. As you will no doubt hear from the panelists and fellow members of the Congressional Caucus on Prescription Drug Abuse, the statistics about this problem speak volumes. In 2010, Mr. Chairman, 254 million prescriptions for opioids were filled in the U.S. That's enough painkillers to medicate every single American adult around the clock for a month. ONDCP has identified prescription drugs as the fastest growing drug problem, easily eclipsing cocaine and heroin abuse. Our military soldiers are coming back from war hooked on these pain pills. In the last 2 years, over 150 soldiers have died from overdoses. In my home state, we are losing about 82 people a month to prescription drug abuse, more than car crashes. Our medicine cabinets are more dangerous than our cars. But statistics are just numbers. The 4 of us on this panel each have been touched in a personal way by this tragedy. In some counties in my district, Mr. Chairman, 50% of all children are living in a home without their parents, over half, in large part because of prescription drug abuse. I've met with single moms struggling to get through drug court, kids living with foster parents, unsure where their real parents are. We've lost mothers, grandfathers, police officers to this scourge. My home county sheriff, Sam Catron, community leader, personal friend, dedicated public servant, was assassinated because of his pursuit of prescription drug traffickers. a tragic loss. My field representative's nephew, a physician in my district, was shot down senselessly by a disgruntled drug abuser unable to get his fix. The most dangerous job in my district, the driver of a delivery truck, UPS, FedEx, carrying drugs by mail. I suspect my colleagues have similar stories that they would share. This epidemic touches big city movie stars and rugged mountain men, and it has to stop. We all recognize that this problem will require a coordinated, multi-pronged approach that incorporates law enforcement, treatment, education, and research. I've worked closely with Congressman Frank Wolf to stand up a leading grant program in the Department of Justice which supports state-run prescription drug monitoring programs. PDMPs monitor the sale and purchases of controlled substances, bridging the gap between legitimate medical need and potential misuse. Since 2002, we've seen the number of states with authorized PDMPs triple from 15 to 48. That's a huge accomplishment, but our work is nowhere near done. The next challenge will be facilitating the secure interstate exchange of data among these PDMPs so we can eliminate once and for all the doctor shopping, which has fueled the pill pipeline around our country. In the next few weeks, I plan to introduce legislation to support the DOJ in opening up lines of communications between states. At the appropriate time, I would request that you give this bill, Mr. Chairman, your immediate consideration. I also helped establish an organization in my congressional district called Operation Unite, standing for unlawful narcotics, investigations, treatment, education. It's a bright star in our charge to empower our youth and create an anti-drug culture and knock out abuse for good. So far, on the law enforcement side of that organization, it covers some 42 counties. Those undercover agents, some 30 of them, have sent to the prison around 4,000 pushers in just my district. Unite, with its focus on investigations, treatment, and education, is a fantastic model, ripe for replication around the country. Operation Unite is the lead sponsor for the National RX Drug Summit later this spring in Florida. Collectively, Ms. Bono Mack, Mr. Ray Hall, Mr. Lynch, and others have introduced a number of bills focused on law enforcement, prescriber education, and research that would help to curb the rising tide of abuse. Many of them have been referred to this subcommittee. While I appreciate the opportunity to elevate this issue, which continues to plague my people and communities around the country, I would much rather see your subcommittee mark up these bills, move the ball forward, and take decisive action to end this debilitating drug problem. And I stand ready, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, willing and able to assist you in any way that you might request.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rogers, and I understand that you have an appropriations meeting to go to, so I think it's best we excuse you, but don't forget the appropriation for our subcommittee, please. Mr. Ray Hall.
Rest assured, Mr. Chairman.
I appreciate the opportunity to be before your distinguished committee today. And while I do outrank Mr. Rogers in seniority, I certainly agree with your yielding to him first as the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, and my dear friend and neighbor from across the river in my district. I appreciate so much.
We'll get you a long way, my friend.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. And I certainly associate myself with his testimony and commend him for his efforts in organizing Unite, to which he referred in his testimony. I appreciate the efforts of my colleagues, my colleague from California, Ms. Bono Mack, and from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch. This is an issue that crosses all partisan lines, philosophical lines, class lines, every line in our society. This issue crosses and affects all of us. I will be presenting testimony to the subcommittee on behalf of law enforcement officials from my district, healthcare professionals, and community leaders. And I'm sure this subcommittee will make this testimony public in our continued efforts to educate the public and the American people as to this tremendous epidemic that faces all of us. It was once described as America's silent epidemic, but it can now be openly witnessed any hour, any day, or any night on countless street corners across the country. It is the crippling epidemic of prescription drug abuse that we are facing. And every day we face news stories and reports of overdoses, deaths, accidents, families torn apart by the vicious cycle of prescription drug abuse. Headlines such as this: dealing with addiction in McDowell County in my district. These appear every day in every newspaper. And believe you me, they are touching stories about how these communities are trying to deal with this vicious cycle. Unlike cocaine or heroin, as Mr. Rogers has said, prescription drugs are legal, frequently prescribed by caring physicians, led by the principal oath of first, do no harm. Yet alarming statistics show that children and adults are blind to the harmful consequences of these drugs, even as they become addicted, paying upwards of $150 per pill to buy them on the black market. Distressingly, my home state of West Virginia has our nation's highest rate of drug-related deaths. In fact, between 01 and 08, more than 9 out of 10 of those deaths involve prescription drugs. And incredibly, as Mr. Rogers has again pointed out, drug overdoses now kill more West Virginians than car accidents. But the alarming use and deaths by prescription drugs is not just in West Virginia. As our other distinguished members will testify, it's across this country. And I could go into the figures, Mr. Chairman, but you have those figures as well about what drug overdose death rates are in this great country, how they've tripled since 1990 and have never been higher in our nation's history. I've met numerous times with law enforcement, community organizations, educators, physicians, and many more of my constituents. We've had drug summits, and we will continue to have networking processes in which we try to involve all aspects of our community and to involve those that are personally affected, to get them to communicate, if they don't want to openly, at least at these networking seminars with those law enforcement officials with whom perhaps they've been afraid to have contact in the past, but now find a forum and find other people in like circumstances as them in which their fear is no longer preventing them from coming forward and telling what is happening on the streets and how they feel the problem can be addressed. So these networks are important. This hearing is vitally important. We must strengthen drug diversion, educate our children and adults on prevention, work with the medical community on addiction and pain treatment, and treat and rehabilitate those that are affected by this vicious addiction before they succumb to the death spiral. There are a number of pieces of legislation I and my colleagues have joined in co-sponsoring. This subcommittee is certainly aware of those, and I leave it in your wisdom to join these bills perhaps, or to pick as you see is most appropriate which bills should make it to the floor of the House of Representatives. But many bills will establish mandatory physician and consumer education, as well as authorizing federal funding to help states create and maintain prescription drug monitoring programs that all states can access. This is one of the bills that I have introduced. It would set up a uniform system for tracking painkiller-related deaths, helping states and law enforcement personnel to be able to manage and report data. The West Virginia State Police, our attorneys general, and even physicians all consistently stress the need to access a prescription drug monitoring system that is shared between state lines and updated in real time. So, Mr. Chairman, I urge you and this subcommittee to consider and move forward on legislation that encompasses the provisions I've mentioned and many others. Let us act with dispatch and compassion, with an acute understanding of the enormity of the challenge before us. I conclude by thanking you once again for conducting this hearing and allowing me and my colleagues to be with you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rahal. Ms. Bono-Mack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am honored to be here with my colleagues as you hold this critically important hearing on the growing and deadly dangers prescription drug abuse poses to our nation. One incident last year in particular graphically captures the seriousness of this issue. On June 19th in Medford, New York, a man walked into a pharmacy and murdered 4 people for 11,000 tablets of hydrocodone. One of those gunned down was a 33-year-old customer who was just engaged to be married. Instead, she was buried in her wedding dress. A 17-year-old pharmacy employee was also killed and later buried in her prom dress along with her high school diploma. This senseless tragedy is just one example of a growing wave of drugstore robberies by prescription drug addicts. But it's also part of a larger, rapidly escalating struggle nationwide against prescription drug abuse and addiction, which is expected to claim the lives of nearly 30,000 Americans this year. Just last weekend, I met in California with dozens of parents who have lost children to this horrible epidemic. 2 classes of medicines, painkillers and insomnia and anxiety drugs, are responsible for about 70 deaths and nearly 3,000 emergency room visits every day. That's right, a day. And these are truly stunning numbers. But what's very insidious is the way these powerfully addictive narcotic prescription drugs quickly turn people without any real or emotional or physical problems into desperate people suddenly facing life or death struggles. Few things are more destructive. According to the CDC, drug overdose is now the leading cause of injury death in the United States, not just in West Virginia, but in the United States, in large part due to prescription drug abuse. It's not hard to understand why. Today, some 12.5 million Americans regularly abuse prescription drugs, and the problem, as I've said, is growing rapidly. There are approximately 7,000 new abusers every day, many of them teenagers and young adults. This alarming trend, now a health epidemic, according to CDC, is taking a huge toll on society. Today, the abuse of prescription drugs, especially painkillers, stimulants, and depressants, is the fastest growing drug problem in America. As chairman of the House Subcommittee on Commerce, Manufacturing, and Trade, which has jurisdiction over consumer protection, I have made combating prescription drug abuse a top priority. I believe there needs to be a national awakening about the threat this alarming epidemic poses to our families and to our communities. Simply put, we are in the midst of an American tragedy. What can we do? For starters, we must do a better job of monitoring and limiting access to prescription drugs containing controlled-release oxycodone hydrochloride, including the popular painkiller and killer, OxyContin. Originally, OxyContin was intended to be prescribed only for severe pain as a way to help patients dealing with last-stage cancer and other severe illnesses. Today, however, more and more people across America are prescribed OxyContin as well as other generic oxycodone drugs for less severe reasons, clinically known as moderate pain, greatly expanding the availability and potential for abuse of these powerfully addictive narcotics. Someone with a toothache or a sore knee should not be prescribed a potentially addictive painkiller. Clearly, expanded public education plays a role in addressing the problem, but we're not going to make any real progress until we limit access to these powerful narcotic drugs and ensure that only patients in severe pain can obtain them. We must also improve prescriber education by getting doctors, dentists, nurse practitioners, and other prescribers up to speed on the dangers of addiction. Today, I have legislation pending in Congress, the Ryan Creedon Act, H.R. 2119, to accomplish this goal. The pervasiveness of prescription drug abuse made national headlines when federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies led by the DEA cracked down on so-called pill mills in Florida, where painkillers were routinely dispensed, just like M&Ms from a gumball machine. Congress needs to make it much more difficult for these rogue pain clinics to operate, and we should treat offenders like any other street drug dealer. By better coordinating the efforts of local, state, and national agencies, and by reducing the supply of highly addictive opioid painkillers, I'm convinced that we can eventually save thousands of lives and spare millions of American families from the heartache of addiction. Mr. Chairman, no child should ever be buried in a prom dress again because we ignored this problem. And I just want to say, in closing, that this past weekend when I met with these parents, a number of them spoke about a Dr. Lisa Seng in Rowland Heights, California, who is being charged for 3 counts of murder for supplying prescription drugs to young men who all overdosed. These parents went and confronted the doctor, and she showed absolutely no remorse whatsoever. And I think we should do all we can to ensure she's put away for a very, very long time if she's found guilty. So thank you very much for allowing me to testify today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Scott, for your kindness in allowing us to testify on this important issue. My colleagues have told the story of drug abuse in America today, but I do want to amplify the issue that Ms. Bono was speaking about, and that is OxyContin. And rather than, I will associate myself with the remarks of the three previous speakers, and rather than take my whole 5 minutes, I just want to offer a couple of thoughts. Number one, this OxyContin is so powerful, it is so powerful, that in a very limited period of time, a person who is prescribed this becomes addicted. And we've seen stats now that 99% of addicts who are involved with heroin that are in facilities today in the United States started on OxyContin. And the pattern is that they stay on OxyContin until they're financially unable to do so, and then they switch over to heroin, which is much, much cheaper. But when you allow a company to create a product that is so powerfully addictive that in a very short time they create customers for life, that's a very troubling situation. It got so bad in my district that I had to create a residential rehab facility, first for boys and then later for girls, because I had these kids getting addicted so young, there's nowhere else to send them. We didn't have any adolescent rehab facilities in my state, so we had to create two. We have a situation now where Purdue Pharma lost their exclusivity, and now OxyContin is going to go generic. This is tremendously powerful. And think about this. The profits here are enormous. We're creating a national health care system that will allow all of these people to continue to financially get the support from these pill mills, the drugs from these pill mills, having the American taxpayer contribute to that. So this is a very, very dangerous situation. And I noticed that on March 1st, OxyContin was actually pulled from the shelves in Canada. That's according to the Toronto Star and the CBC News. I sponsored legislation here in Congress several years ago to remove OxyContin from the market. But let's face it, there are so many drug company lobbyists up here that bill didn't have a prayer, because the pharmaceutical company lobbyists outnumber members of Congress probably 7-1. We've got a serious problem here. And I commend you for giving us the time here to try to address it, and I commend my colleagues for the fights that they're making in their own districts, and now hopefully we'll be able to collectively use our experience to push this issue nationally. So I thank you for your time. I appreciate it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Lynch. I'd like to thank all of the members of Congress who took time out of their schedules to come and testify here, as well as the members on the subcommittee who have come and listened to all of these graphic stories. And I'm sure that this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is a very serious issue. It is one that needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed in the proper manner. Does the gentleman from Virginia have anything else he wants to say or to insert into the record?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, another RAND study showing that supply demand investments work better than supply control.
Without objection, the material is inserted.
Mr. Chairman, can I congratulate you on starting our inquiry in this manner with members of Congress who have some great and different experiences about this problem, and I thank you for starting.
Well, I thank the Chairman Emeritus. I'm always happy to accept congratulations. They mean more from this side of the aisle than my own. So, again, thank you very much, and without objection, the committee stands adjourned.